There's a lot of focus these days on upcycling and recycling within products. And I think we need to expand that thinking into really looking at our cities and start understanding the value of redeveloping, and whether it be brownfields or incremental or public space strategies in existing areas, to say, how can we actually take what we have already developed and improve it and make it better for the future?
Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Please don't forget to follow Urbanistica on the different social media platforms, and also let's connect on LinkedIn. Big thanks to Urbanistica podcast partner AFRY. AFRY is an international engineering and design company providing sustainable solutions in the fields of energy, industry, and infrastructure. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. I have the pleasure to welcome Kristian to Urbanistica podcast. Hey, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Working from home today, as many of us are from time to time. Had the pleasure for traveling a little bit last week, but otherwise mostly based in Copenhagen, which is unusual for me.
Yeah, I see it's sunny in Copenhagen, or there is a light.
I think I think it's a lucky reflection. It's a normal fall grayish day here as well.
Yeah, the same. Like here in Stockholm, almost dark.
Yeah.
So, should we start?
Sure, let's do that.
Are you ready?
It feels ready.
Yes. So you are our storyteller for this episode. Feel free. The stage is yours. The mic is yours. How would you love to introduce yourself and tell us about your passion?
So my name is Kristian Villadsen. I'm a partner and director at Gehl in Copenhagen. I'm an architect, of course, and you can say my passion is very much about, of course, designing and making cities for people, but also understanding how the way we design cities influence how we live a life and how that can impact a more sustainable future for all of us, hopefully.
Yeah. And this passion to create cities for people, when did it start?
Well, I think it's almost like textbook stereotype. I have an architect dad and a mom that's a teacher. So I grew up between construction sites and this mom who just embraced and loved and cared for everyone. So that's sort of the way back story. But I think maybe more recent, or when I started really working with architecture, first at the School of Architecture, but also later as a professional, I realized as much as I loved sort of the aesthetics, the design, beautiful design, all these kind of things that you as an architect tend to like, I also found that I was actually more interested in, you can say, the awareness that you can create with physical objects and form, almost like how artists or some contemporary artists work with creating awareness by being provocative or in form and these kind of things. So I was very interested in how architecture isn't just a beautification, but also something that actually is very much in our face and forces us to take a stand on one thing or another. And I think that was then, shaped through my education with good professors, working around the world. My place also a mission-driven office like Gehl, where we work to make cities for people, basically.
Yeah, so many different interesting elements in your journey.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and also you're wearing the black T-shirt, architect.
Yeah. In that sense, I'm still stereotype.
But it's actually, I'm so happy. Like every time I talk to an architect, and the architect telling me that I am passionate about creating things for people, so which is great. And this is also going to be the core of our topic. We're going to talk about form follow function.
Yeah.
And in your opinion, it's going to be function follow form. So it's super interesting. I would love to start that. Tell us more about form follow function, like the background of it.
Yeah, of course, form follow function is probably the most one of the most shaping terms for the last century, basically. So I think it's Louis Sullivan is going to have said it first. This form follow function, it was very much a part of the whole modernist movement. This idea that we should architecture and design should rid itself of ornamentation. It could all of a sudden we could mass produce things in terms of design, but also in terms of buildings. We got these new material, steel, glass, concrete, that allowed us to build a different kind of aesthetic, but also a much more functional driven architecture. And that's sort of that kind of form follow function where it sort of resonates with Louis Sullivan and of course the early modernist thinking in the beginning of the last century, but certainly really impacted our way of thinking about architecture and design and cities in especially after the Second World War and up until maybe the 1980s, 90s, and up until today actually. So that's sort of the legacy of it.
But how did it impact our way of thinking and designing cities?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's form follow function makes a lot of sense when you're designing a doorknob or when you're designing a chair. It makes a lot of sense that a chair is something you need to be able to sit at. Form follow function, the way it really impacted in a large scale, the way our cities look today is it was also this kind of rethinking of how we plan cities. It was an organization of how the cities were structured and how planning codes were structured. So all of a sudden we had this kind of traffic planning, housing, green, all these kind of different organizations within our city body that cared for one element. So it was a very engineered thinking in terms of how we plan cities. You could live there, you could work there, and you can shop over there, and you can take your car in between. So in that sense, it had an impact that was far beyond object design and building design. It was really about how we lived our life and how we regulated and organized everything around decision making in our cities. And that's, of course, the big legacy in reality of modernism.
Yeah, and when you started to learn architecture at the school, what did you study? Also this way of thinking?
Of course, I think it was when you trained around the time I was. Of course, form follow function was something that was very much part of an aesthetic. It was part of a keep it real. There was a lot of these kind of things, cut it to the bone. There was a lot of these kind of impact that went really well. We had in the 90s this kind of even a secondary wave with the whole Dutch school around Koolhaas, where it was like this off the shelf. It had to be very honest, everything, which was sort of a second wave of modernism, which was a different kind of aesthetics. But again, this kind of you can say still building on that kind of approach to architecture.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting also to know how you shifted from this way of thinking to the new way. But I would love to ask, you mentioned like the building should be honest. What do you mean as an architect by being honest?
Yeah, I think that was part of, or there was maybe it actually came later, but I think there was something where all of a sudden we were very aware of this, that a building should show how it was constructed, that I was cutting it back, that it shouldn't be, gift wrapped to look like something it wasn't. So there was something there where, and it was very much, you can say, down to building on this modernistic idea that it was true to, there was a direct link between, you can say, the structure, the function, and of course the form. Form should follow the function. And this is maybe moving towards where I changed, is that you say you were always dealing with a function, a functionality. It could be the structural function of the building, but it was often the program of the building. It was often very monofunctional and was solving a element or a object in a city and not actually dealing with the bigger equation that a city is.
Yeah, and now like as an urban planner working with the cities, what I see is like each building, it's a project by its own. There is no relation between the building and the surroundings. Yeah, and I think the focus was all in on the building, not really on what's happening around.
Yeah, I think that's still one of the biggest challenges that we have today, that we tend to solve within a boundary line or a side boundary. And I think that's something that is part of that history, but it's of course also part of how we scope projects, how economy works, how we regulate. So there's a lot of, it isn't just the architects solving one problem, but it's also the whole organizational structure around decision-making, regulation, and the economic drivers of a city.
Yeah. So Kristian, tell me, when was the moment when you be like, okay, this is not really what we're supposed to do, and we should like really switch it?
Yeah. So very early on, I was working a lot with basically the 1960s developments of the Western world, the Millennium Program, as you call it in Sweden. These kind of areas that were built really fast, built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, very much building out the modernistic ideal. It was often large monofunctional residential areas. At its best, it would have a shopping mall at the core, a highway going through it, these kind of areas. And what was interesting and also alarming to me is how many of these areas had actually become deprived housing areas across the Western world, from the United States to all of Europe, to even Russia and Asia further on. And I was trying to figure out why is it that these areas specifically have a tendency to become deprived housing areas. And of course, some of it had to do with ownership, renting, these kind of things. It had to do with social structures of an organization. But there was also something here where you had something where people were often in a situation where they were maybe vulnerable, they were socially vulnerable, they were maybe out of a job. There was a number of parameters that goes with often that goes hand in hand with deprived housing areas. And it was like a perfect storm, because it was linked also to a physical disconnection to the rest of the city. And that was something that blew my mind a little bit. I worked with a large estate in Malmö called Rosengård. And it's an estate of, I think, more than 10,000 apartments. I think there's about 25,000 people living there. And it's completely segregated in a Malmö context. There's this, and of course, there's been a lot of discussion about this, but Zlatan Ibrahimovic grew up there, the famous Swedish soccer player, and in his fictional, non-fictional book, he says, "I never left Rosengård until I was 17." And of course, I can imagine it's a story, but there's also some truth to it. It was literally placed 800 meters from the sort of pedestrian network of the inner city, and still completely isolated. So for me, it was interesting that you had these areas where you could say the people that lived there often didn't have a job or a social network that gave them a reason to leave the area on a daily basis. And at the same time, because these were huge monofunctional housing areas, no jobs inside, with no real few shops inside, very locally based, no one from the outside had a reason to go in. And all of a sudden, you stopped sharing public spaces, you stopped sharing streets, all these things that normally is what makes a part of a society, is sharing the infrastructure of the city, was lost. And I realized that actually then the function started following the form. For these were shaped to be housing areas, and they were shaped to be monofunctional, and they were just that. And they were actually designed to be houses in a park, it was called. In reality, it was green grass that was very little used, as we found when we did our surveys, and often unsafe. So that made me realize that maybe this, maybe it's more right in an urban scale to think about function as something that actually follows form and of the buildings and the programs of the buildings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you watched the reality and you reflected about why the different things happening, and not really like keep going with the business as usual of designing cities and blocks.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really helpful and healthy to think about this bigger equation. To say it's not just I'm designing the best housing building in the world, but what really matters is how does that housing building actually cater for the people that live in it to connect to the rest of society. And I think that's turning it around, and that's how I came to play with words and say maybe we should think more about how the function actually follows the form.
So let's start with, how do you, Kristian, define form?
Yeah, I think I would say that actually form is our everything in a physical environment that is non-natural. So it's you can say the physical framework around us is what shapes our life, and everything around us that isn't naturally grown is something that we have shaped and given form. So that for me is, I guess, the form of our cities.
And how is the function? How do you define it?
I think there's two levels to it. I think one thing is the function of an object. So it's a house we live in, an office we work in, etc. But functions also the behavior that a certain physical environment encourages. You can say that, we end up being in this situation where function is actually a spin-off of the physical environment around us and the functions that are in those physical objects.
Mm-hmm. And I guess this concept is, let's say, is a kind of new compared to all the modernism time. So what are the advantages of following this kind of equation?
Well, I think first of all, and I think that goes a little bit also with where we are, that we realize that today the most important aspect of how we live a life is basically that we live a life that is sustainable. And for me, something that came out of this whole discussion of function for the form is this kind of passion for sustainable behavior. How can we actually encourage sustainable behavior? And I think that's where these things sort of link up, because we have to think about how all the objects that we design, how buildings, how we design cities, how that actually encourage people to live more sustainable. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the core for me.
Yeah, and when we say sustainable behavior, are we talking about the people or also about the transportation, the buildings, the energy, energy smart buildings?
So for me, I think it's fantastic what's happening these years with certifications of buildings, certification of neighborhood. We're getting so much better at recycling, upcycling, building energy efficient buildings. And a lot of this has become standard and even a market driver. Today, a lot of the developers we're sitting with are actually seeing sustainability and certification as a market driver, which is a fantastic thing to have. But at the end of the day, it's still, as long as it's within the envelope of a building or a smaller neighborhood, it still is not the same as saying that we are living a sustainable life. One of the sort of things that I stumbled upon over the years was this kind of research that was done in Copenhagen, where they found that if you put a standard Danish office building next to public transport, you would save 5 times the CO2 as if you put a zero emission office building in a car dependent area, simply because the mobility choices of the people that worked in the building had a much bigger impact on the CO2 footprint than what you could gain from going from a standard, which is a high standard in Denmark, building to a zero emission building. And of course, these data are always indicative and so on, but it just gave a very strong sentiment for saying, okay, it's not just about the object or the building or the local. It's about everything that has to do with our daily life, and it's about encouraging people to live more sustainable.
Yeah, I think we are back to where you started. It's not about only the dots, but we should really connect them together and step back, reflect, and see what is the smarter or the more sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we can do a lot to invite people to have a more sustainable life. We can do a lot to build neighborhoods that are truly mixed, that will allow a more kind of 15-minute community experience. And I think we simply have a responsibility to do this.
Yeah. How do you see, you mentioned the market is really willing to be more sustainable, like the retail investors and so on. Here, like in Stockholm, I tell the property owners that it's great that you make money. It's not wrong, and it's greater if you do it in a sustainable way. Like invest in sustainable buildings. Yeah. How is it down in Copenhagen, and how is it like worldwide? Because I know you have so many different projects everywhere.
Yeah. So I think actually, I didn't reflect too much about, but what I do on a daily basis is I've almost had like 3 lives. You can say I'm working actually a lot with developers and in a Northern European context, you can say. So also Stockholm for that matter. But of course Denmark, especially the German-speaking parts of Europe. I've had a lot of talk with different developers. So that's one part of what I do, and I'll get back to that. I've also had since 2008, I've been advising an NGO in Beijing that works with sustainable development on the Chinese cities, which is a completely different situation altogether, but also incredibly meaningful to be involved in. And then I've actually had quite a lot of dialogue also on the future of mobility and the mobility changes that we're seeing, not just within you can say all these kind of new small mobility objects like the scooters and the bike share, these kind of things, but also public transport and even the car industry are really starting to realize that change is coming within mobility. So I think the question you have is basically means different things, of course, in different contexts. But I would say generally there is an awareness across developers that building sustainable is, of course, part of the future. No one can really ignore this anymore. The question, of course, is how much can you embrace? And as I said, sometimes it's not just the limitation of the developer and the vision of the developer. It's actually also the boundaries and the way we organize and regulate our cities that becomes a barrier in these discussions. So I think we're moving towards a situation where we in many ways are collaborating across sector to go toward a more sustainable goal. And I think maybe we are moving towards a place now where the words and what we're doing is actually getting closer to actually being supportive of each other. And I think that's quite nice.
Do you feel that we are doing it in a very slow motion way, like that we're doing things together in a more collaborative, sustainable, like cities, private sectors?
I think we are to some extent. We are better at running processes where we empower visioning processes that is cross-sector, that actually allow us to understand each other and where we're coming from. I think that's something we work a lot with, and I think that's something that in general is work more with. I think we still have a long way to go. We spoke earlier about modernism, and I think I read somewhere that 95% of the world's planning regulation was written from 1950 to 1970, when modernist thinking was really blossoming. And of course, also the way we organize ourselves is in cities is still very often aligned with the modernist thinking, where we have these different departments instead of a more sort of, you can say, cross-sector or holistic approach to thinking about planning, where we start by defining the vision and then finding out how each sector can support that vision.
Yeah, it was a lot of talk about how do we make it more creative bureaucracy.
Yeah,
and I think we had many steps until we're really there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there is, and I think we need to find a balance where both things can work. And I think part of it is bringing in processes that allow us to share a vision across sectors, because I think we can't remove the bureaucracy, and we can't remove the regulation overnight. But what we can do is we can bring people to a point where they can share a vision, and with their expertise help or work together on finding how we can best optimize each project. And I think that's the way we should move ahead.
Yeah. And tell me, what are the disadvantages with function follow form in your case?
Well, I think, of course, the disadvantage is that if we ignore it, and I think that's still happening a lot. I mean, that's still something that's happening quite extensively. That we, as we said before, that we have a lot of projects where we work within a site boundary, where we say we are solving this problem, but then as soon as you start to focus on a problem, you're actually ignoring a lot of other issues. And I think that's probably the challenge, that we're not there yet. We're not there where we fully are embracing this, that whenever we do something in terms of shaping our cities, we will also impact the overall function of our cities.
Mm-hmm. Can you make it more concrete for me? Can you give us an example about how do you do that in reality?
I think so. There's good and bad examples, and I think one example that got me happy here during the COVID lockdown is that back in 2015-16, we were part of advising the city of Shanghai, which basically became there's three elements that came up of it. It was a public space strategy for the inner city, the historical city center of Hongpu district in Shanghai. It was a quality-driven development plan for actually the entire river, which is more than 100 kilometers of brownfield area along the Hongpu River in Shanghai. And it was, and maybe most significantly, it was a street design guideline for Shanghai. And I'll get to two levels of projects in it basically, but the Shanghai Street Design Guideline for me was super interesting because it was the first time a Chinese city recognized streets as public spaces. Mm-hmm. And basically 20-30% of our cities globally are streets, which means that streets often are the primary public space. And especially in China, they don't have our tradition or the European tradition of public spaces, of squares and so on. So the street is really an important public space. So just that recognition was important. And as such, that project had a huge impact because a lot of cities followed Shanghai in doing this. And just to emphasize the important, before that, the Chinese cities only defined the streets by how many cars it could take per hour. So a very, very quantitative definition of a street and not a very quality-driven definition of street. So that's one side. The other thing that we did was, as I said, a public space strategy. And here we pointed to basically, there was sort of a missing link between the waterfront, the Bund, and Nanjinglu, the pedestrian street in Shanghai. There was about a good kilometer of road space there, where 85% of the space was given to traffic, but actually 95% of the movement were pedestrian and only 4% of the movement was traffic. And we provided this data and we did sort of a transformation strategy, and we handed it over to the Hongpu district and the mayor. And it's been very quiet, but it was a very sort of evidence-based way of saying, okay, if we should actually have a function that follows the form or a function that sort of support, we need to actually change the form here to support the functionality. And just here this summer during the lockdown, I all of a sudden received photos from friends that they had now implemented it. So we weren't involved in the implementation. I don't know which great designer did the last detailing, but it was, at the end of the day, it was the concept was right. So for me, that's that kind of understanding of also saying, okay, function follows form, but we can actually use that also to improve the form and shape of our cities. So that was, yeah.
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations for being all of this implemented in reality. It's great to see.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And it was interesting, like how they moved or they switched their mindset from like counting cars to more like open it to people.
Yeah. And it is this change of mindset that I think is important, that they recognize that we need to look at our cities differently.
I have a question in mind. Sometimes this great projects happen because the municipality are big and have good money to invest and to hire a great architect like you. So what if I am a small municipality, but I would really love to give my city to people and think more sustainable? What should I do? How should I do that?
I think, we often say here, and I know you spoke with a few of my colleagues, but at the office here, we always say, ask first, what kind of life would you like to see? And then what kind of spaces would support that life, and what kind of buildings could support the life? So basically starting with the function, the overall function that you would like to, what kind of life would you like to live? And I think that's sort of that would be a good way to start thinking about how to change behavior. I think it's also something where a lot of people have said this, but I often argue we should make it easy to do good. And of course, simply saying, how can we create an design of our city that actually invites us to make that sustainable choice on a daily basis, not because it's sustainable, because it's the easiest way to use the city. So I think there's some questions there that can be really good to bring up. I think still also, as I said before, using visioning processes can be a very, very powerful way of changing how we plan cities. And I think that can be an element as well.
Yeah. Does it cost so much money to start think about this?
No, I think that's just it creates it's a different kind of change of behavior. It's the change of the routine in our cities, and I think that's in at the end of the day maybe cost free, but of course you have to yourself and the organizations have to recognize the value of it.
And as an architect and me as an urban planner, like if I ask you back to your project in China, what are the challenges that you were facing in order to really follow that function, follow form?
I think function, follow form. It is very much about creating awareness that something is, you can say, a spin-off effect of something else that you do. And sometimes that means you have to go back and finding out what is it that I'm doing wrong, so that our cities become dysfunctional. And I think that's the kind of learning loop that we have to have in all our cities. That we have to recognize that often our challenges are linked to something else that we think is part of the solution, and then finding out how can we adapt these things and how can we change this. So often it can be in a city like in Shanghai, which of course is far from here, they are still building monofunctional, disconnected areas to a large extent, where if you go to a city like Beijing, the average commute is 96 minutes. That's pretty far from a 15-minute community. On the other hand, they are really aware of the value of this, and also the lack of quality and sustainability in having the kind of life they have today. So they do want to change. But one thing is saying we want to change. The other thing is defining and understanding what's the root of the problem to start with.
Yeah. What do you think about the 15 minutes city or district?
I think it's something that you have to understand at different scales, because it's very much about your experience. So for me, 15-minute is not just 15-minute walk. I think there's certain things I love to have within a 15-minute walk. There's certain things that I would like to have within, especially when we're talking major cities, not Stockholm and Copenhagen. They're so small that we can actually have a 15-minute life. But when we look globally, it's also about saying, okay, there's certain things I actually need to have within 15 minutes. I need to be able to have my grocery shopping, go to the daycare, go to the library, go to the hospital, go get an education, go get a job. All of this is something that I need to have, go work or have the society be present in some kind of form within 15 minutes. And then there's something that is maybe more a city level 15 minute, where it's what can I reach 15 minute on rail? Because I think that's where we see in major cities that metros and rail is really where you can make a difference in terms of the radius of your times, where basically in a city like Shanghai and Beijing, it's almost as fast to bike as it is to take your car, because the city is gridlocked. So rail is really the answer. And there's certain things that it can be larger universities, it can be the big park, it can be the stadium. So that's a different kind of, or that very important public space that is sort of city identity given, and where you feel that you are part of something greater. So I think those is a different kind of 15-minute society. Here in Copenhagen or Stockholm, we almost already have a 15-minute society.
Yeah, it's a really good reflection, because I had a kind of the same conversation when I was giving a lecture last month in KTH here, and I thought that we should really be careful when we say 15 minutes, because if we just focus on the 15 minutes of walk, maybe then we are kind of back to Zlatan's story that you're just locked down in your box in your area, and this is a kind of dangerous, because the focus will be only on this zone within 15 minutes and really don't care about what's happening around. So it's a good reflection.
Yeah, I think it is really relatable to scale, and also just recognizing that there is different needs we have within different kind of 15 minutes in our city.
And Kristian, tell us more about the challenges that you're facing, like in your daily job. What kind of challenges that you have?
Well, I think I try to insist that, for instance, we always look outside site boundary, that we try to, whether we're working with cities or we're working with developers, that we try to understand how the project impacts the life, not just of the area, but the bigger life of the city, and how it brings something new and improves life in the city. So that's kind of course, those are the challenges that I sit with, because I'm also working within the norm. So I'm also, of course, facing organization regulations, economical boundaries, all these kind of things. But I think we have a responsibility as architects to keep challenging the idea of a site boundary, and the idea of a sort of a defined scope of program, and always insist on saying this is part of something bigger that is our cities. Yeah,
so it's always about pushing the limit and see what we can do more in a creative way.
Yeah, I think it's as much also empowering people to have a change of mind and understanding that what we're solving isn't just about one envelope. It's actually about how that envelope impacts the world around it.
And how much is it about teamworking and listening to others?
I think we do that, of course. That's a huge part of it. Understanding context is, working globally. That's always something that you have to be very aware of. That you should really understand local context. And of course, we listen in many different ways. We listen through interviews, to talking with collaborators, but we also listen in terms of our data collection. That we go out and actually look at how people are using the city. So you can say listening without actually talking, but listening by observing behavior in a city to understand the context you are in. And I think these things are incredibly important to actually delivering on any project.
Yeah, and I know many students are listening to the podcast, and it's a great opportunity that I would love to ask you, because as a student, you fall in love with your solution and you don't really open to other input. So what is your comment about this?
But I think that's, I don't think there's nothing wrong with passion, and it's great to be in love with your solution, so to speak. But I think it's just to recognize that any solution has a spin-off impact on everything around it. And as long as you can, you understand that and realize the impact that the solution have, then it's okay. But at the end of the day, you also have to, as I said, take that responsibility and understand what is it that your building do, or your public space or your master plan, what is it does to the greater context.
Well, it's a great advice, not only for the students, but to all us of architects also, like working in real life. So it was very inspiring to talk with you about the topic, and now I'm really curious about what is your favorite city.
Maybe not surprising after what I just told you. I actually really like Shanghai. I think Shanghai is an amazing city that I had the pleasure of being in a number of times, and it's an interesting city because it's a city that, despite its sort of amazing development over the last couple of decades still actually have streets that you can walk on. You can walk from one end of the city to the other. You can have really nice center experiences, experience of daily life in the very heart. So that's one city that I would certainly say is one of my favorite, for better and worse. There's also a lot that I absolutely
I can imagine.
Like about it, but that's I guess part of the fascination. It challenges me, and I think that's nice. And of course, in a European city context, cities like Vienna, Berlin, Copenhagen, Stockholm. I mean, there's a number of cities that I think have different qualities that I really can appreciate.
Yeah, that's awesome. And is there any specific public space that you would love to be there, like every morning? When you wake up, you'll be like, I want to be there.
Well, I actually I thought about that, and I think my answer is actually the street. Not a street, like a specific street, but streets in general, because I think this is like by far the most ignored and at the same time actually most important public space we have. It's probably the public space that's most determining for our sustainable footprint. Whether we walk or we bike or we take the car, it's very often defined by the streets around us. So it's something that is really important. I think the street is also interesting because it's where we meet despite. So it's the street is something where everybody goes, no matter background, economical situation, cultural situation. It's something we share and where we see each other as we are human beings. So for me, the street is really, in that sense, also a super interesting public space, not as a specific, but as a general public space that is too often ignored in cities.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the very interesting reflections, Kristian.
Well, thank you.
So apart from all the cities for people and enjoying work to make cities great, what are your hobbies? What do you do in your spare time?
Well, I have 2 kids, so they take up a lot of my spare time. I would like to say that I have 2 kayaks. They often just sit in my backyard and are not used. So there's, I think it's not that different. I love travel. I love actually going to the countryside as well and being outside the city. I think that's important to have that opportunity. So there's a lot of these kind of things that I guess you can call hobbies. But I'm also kind of lucky because I have a job I really like. So there's a built-in hobby to that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Is it difficult to raise up the kids or to raise up the buildings and fix the city?
Well, the kids have a mind of their own. But no, I think it's I think what the kids do is they give you motivation. I think they just become very aware that we have to leave behind something that is where everything that we have been influencing and designing is helping making the world more sustainable. And I think this is said a lot, but it becomes very real when you have kids. Of course, you become even more aware of it.
Yeah, awesome. So again, thank you so much for giving your valuable time to record this episode. And I would love that we finish this episode that you give 3 takeaway messages to all the listeners.
Yeah, and I think we actually I noted something down and we almost talked about it. I thought we talked about it already because I said, we have to stop thinking about a project as something that has a site boundary. And then I think we should start really evaluating sustainable behavior as a thing on its own. So a city should, we talk a lot about smart cities, but really it is to use data to evaluate, learn, and improve on delivering the vision. So there's something there that I think is a really important. And then I think I think it's the last thing maybe is that there's a lot of focus these days on upcycling and recycling within building products. And I think we need to expand that thinking into really looking at our cities and start understanding the value of redeveloping, and whether it be brownfields or incremental or public space strategies in existing areas, to say, how can we actually take what we have already developed and improve it and make it better for the future? I think that's so upscaling, go large would be an interesting topic to discuss for the future.
Yeah, this is very interesting because here in Sweden also the government launched this circular economy.
Yeah.
And everything should be like circular. And I think it's very interesting to talk also about how do we recycle our cities or some part of our cities.
Yeah, and I think we are with a lot of these days our production patterns has changed. So we have a lot of course industrial areas, brownfields in our cities that we are redeveloping into more mixed use areas. And I found that super interesting because when we do that, we also build on existing infrastructure. We build on existing public transport network, and we have an opportunity to build into something where we improve it and make it more efficient, but also don't have to build from scratch. So yeah, exactly. I think this kind of upcycling our cities is important, and maybe benefit also densifying areas like the deprived housing areas gives a chance to give new value to areas that has sort of been lost a little bit on the way.
Yeah. Super interesting. Great. Do you have also 3 hashtags for the episode?
Oh man, I'm too old. I'm terrible at hashtags. I'm guessing like cities for people and sustainable behavior would be some of them, but
this is actually really cool. I use a lot cities for people. I love this hashtag. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kristian. So what is the next step for you?
I think it's. I actually hope to be able to continue what I do, where I have the pleasure of working with different aspects of the cities, from the private developer to the city authorities to mobility providers, and actually starting to bridging these different sectors that were maybe traditional, seeing each other as counterparts and saying how can they actually collaborate on building cities that are better for us.
Yeah. Thank you, and wish you all the good luck.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. You learned something new and also got inspired by the guest. Don't forget to share the episode on your social media and recommend it to people you think they are really interested in this topic. Thank you so much again for giving your valuable time to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.